I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Deon Benton. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Vanderbilt University, where he runs the Computational Cognitive Development Lab and studies children's causal, social, and moral reasoning. Deon, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation. So nice to be here. As I said off air, I listened to a couple of your episodes, and this is a really fantastic podcast. And so I'm thrilled and honored to be able to be yet another guest on this podcast.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. How did you become interested in child development?
Yeah, this is a great question. Just by way of background, I earned my bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Arizona with honors. And so I was actually in the honors program. And I reached out to a number of faculty, both within the psychology department as well as in the neuroscience department, asking whether or not they were accepting research assistants. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study, but I knew that to graduate with honors, I would have to write an honors thesis, right? And to do that, especially if it's a research-based honors thesis, I would have to join a research lab. And so a couple of folks got back to me. One guy, Dr. Wilfila Gronenberg, who was in the neuroscience department, he runs a B lab, or he ran a B lab. So he got
Actual
back to
bees,
me.
the animals?
Yeah, the animal insect. He got back to me, but at the same time, a lady named Rebecca Gomez, Dr. Rebecca Gomez, who runs the Child Cognition Lab at the University of Arizona in the psychology department, also got back to me, and both of them were willing to have me take me on as a research assistant. So I actually joined both labs, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do. After about 2 weeks in Wolfila's lab, it became quickly apparent that making infinitesimally small slices of bee brains wasn't really my cup of tea. And so at that point, I made the decision that, okay, I'm going to go all in the child cognition lab. And this was the summer before my sophomore year, I want to say. So it was pretty early on that I joined a research lab. And I stuck around because the work was just fascinating. So your question, right, was what got me interested in this sort of line of work, and it was working in a developmental lab and seeing the kind of ingenuity that carrying out an infant and child study requires, right? So doing work with infants in particular, requires that you come up with pretty clever techniques for answering your questions, right? So unlike adult work where you can ask adults questions, right? You can't really do that with a baby. I mean, you could, but you wouldn't get any useful answers, right? And so you have to be pretty clever. And I also like solving puzzles. And so I saw that doing this kind of work was almost like solving jigsaw and logic puzzles. And so I was just sort of I naturally gravitated toward this line of work. And that's really my origin story for how I got interested in this line of work, albeit truncated, of course.
What were you studying in that first lab, and what type of methods did you use?
In the B lab,
Mm-hmm.
or yeah,
Oh,
so
in the child
yeah,
development
okay, you're
lab.
right. That's right. So in Rebecca is a renowned infant language researcher. She's done a lot of work looking at different aspects of infant statistical learning, right? Statistical learning is an umbrella term for a suite of capacities that babies bring to the language task, right? That allows them to, among other things, extract words from speech, right? And so she's really known for her work on a mechanism called non-adjacent dependency learning, right? So imagine a three-word phrase, dad loves dog, right? Any number of verbs can replace love. And the question she was after, or she's answered, or she's studied rather, is can babies learn a relationship between dad and dog, right? and sort of ignored the intervening element. And what she's shown is that if the set size of the intervening element is sufficiently large, babies are actually able to learn these non-adjacent dependencies, right? And so a lot of her work, focuses on these various capacities. And so when I was in the lab, I was actually helping in the very beginning and actually throughout my time in the lab with the infant language research. And so for those who don't do this kind of work, a technique that is often used to study infant language learning is what's sometimes called the head turn preference procedure. This is a simple paradigm, a technique whereby babies are brought into a lab. They're made to sit on a chair with their parents. So they're usually sitting on mom or dad's lap, and they are in a three-sided chamber. In front of the baby is some sort of light or some sort of attention getter, right? It's meant to orient to if the babies get distracted, it's meant to bring them back, right? To get them back on task. And then on either side of the baby are speakers that play sound. And you can use this kind of method to answer various questions having to do with how babies learn language and how they segment speech. And so I was doing a lot of language work at the time, or early on. And then at some point during my time in the lab, I worked with Rebecca to come up with an honors thesis project, which actually had nothing to do with language learning. It was a project that focused on how babies and when babies can segregate objects, right? So imagine that I have, so obviously the listener can't see, but you can see. So I'm holding a bottle and I'm holding my phone. If I make the two adjacent, Adam, that this display is made up of two objects, right? And you know that based on a whole bunch of things, namely the configural cues, right? And the question is, when do babies actually use these cues? And we were also interested in what role sleep plays in this process, right? And so it turns out that at a certain age, babies are actually unable to actually rely on or to use those cues. How do we know that? Well, what you do is you show babies two kinds of events. You show them what's sometimes called the move together event. So in this event, the display is like this. So the display starts off adjacent. So each object is adjacent to one another. A hand comes in and then pulls the display across the stage. It's called the move together event because both objects move together, right? The move apart event is similar, except that when the hand grabs a hold of one of the objects, the display comes apart. And so if babies think that the display is made up of two objects, what would you predict they would look? Which of the two events would you predict babies would look longest at? It would be the display where they move together, right? If they think that the display is made up of two objects, right, and the display moves together, then that's sort of a surprising event. And it turns out that if you give them just a little bit of sleep, right, they are able to actually pass this task, that is, they look longer when the display moves together.
So
right.
in adults, there's some research or theories about sleep being this period of consolidation of what you've learned throughout the day. Is that what's going on in babies?
That's the theory, right? So the idea is that maybe one of the reasons why babies who aren't given given the opportunity to sleep is that they just don't have sufficient time to consolidate, right, the display. And so if I show up to their house with one part of the display and I show that part to them for 30 seconds, I believe it was, if that comes right before sleep, the idea is that during sleep, they're forming a representation, or they're consolidating the representation of the thing that I showed them, such that when they come to the lab, right, and I show them the move together and move apart event, they look much longer at the move together event because they would have seen one half of that display, and therefore they would have recognized, maybe not realized, what realize is a strong cognitive connotations, but in any case, they would have noticed, right, that the display consists of two objects and not one. And that was the working theory, because she also does a lot of work, at least these days, looking at the role of sleep on a variety of things, right? Yeah.
When you have these different developmental milestones of being able to tell two objects apart or being able to connect noun and verb and extract meaning from it. What does it tell us when it happens at a different time? Like if you do these studies and you find out that something it develops at 2 months versus 6 months versus a year, like what difference does it make knowing their developing it anyway? What do you get out of mapping the specific age that these milestones happen at?
Yeah, so mapping, so there's two separate questions here. Mapping when these capacities emerge is part of the story. To me, that's the least interesting part, right? The most interesting part is how these capacities emerge to begin with. That is,
Mhm.
right, we're going back to a basic philosophical question. What are the origins of knowledge, right? And the reason I am principally interested in elucidating those mechanisms by which, right, these capacities emerge is that by understanding the mechanism, right, we can actually intervene to improve performance of atypically developing populations. Now, I don't do that myself, right? But my work absolutely has, and work on mechanism absolutely has those implications, right? Moreover, I can actually build computational models, right? To explore whether or not my thinking about what's going on under the hood to allow these capacities to emerge to begin with is on the right path, right? And so, mapping, coming up with the developmental timetables is one thing. It's interesting, I suppose, right? Because we want to know when something happens, but like science is all about understanding how things come about so we can actually manipulate, right? What are the three goals of science? It's prediction, right? Explanation and control. If you understand the mechanism, you can do all three, right? And so, that to me, and obviously, and again, to answer your question directly, that's important because it has implications for all sorts of things, not least of which it can inform intervention-based research, which I don't do, but my work has implications for, right?
We get into the weeds of nature and nurture. On one hand, there's going to be interventions that you can make to the child's environment that shape the different developmental outcomes. But then there seems to be a limit to that because you could imagine taking like a chimpanzee baby and putting it into the most nurturing human environment, like a baby Einstein program, and it's never going to learn language the way we can. So there's something innate about the human mind that's hardwired for language and other types of more advanced thinking that other animals can do. What is it about us that makes that possible?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. It's an important question, right? And the answer you get depends on who you ask, right? So if you ask a symbolic systems researcher, right, someone who believes in the language of thought, right, which comes from Fodor, they might say, oh, the difference is that we can, we have structured representations and that our thought is productive, right? We can entertain an infinite number of expressions from a finite number of concepts, right, and ideas. And that we can structure these representations hierarchically, right? And that's one of the key differences between, some may argue, right, that separates us from our non-human from non-human primates, right? That's one possible answer. Another possible answer is that yeah yeah, this is a great question. What distinguishes us from non-human primates? I guess one answer is that we're born with certain kinds of knowledge, although I don't find that answer to be particularly persuasive. I do think that we humans, and this may or may not be true for non-human primates, but at least we're at what I'm willing to entertain is the idea that we're born with certain kinds of biases. I sometimes call them orienting biases that cause us to fixate on different aspects of the world, right? So William James once said that the world is a blooming, buzzing confusion, right? But that couldn't be further from the truth, at least in my view. I think the world is quite structured. That structure combined with these innate biases, orienting biases, I think are enough to get learning off the ground. And it may be the case that some of those biases that we have don't show up in other species. So, like one bias we have, right, is that babies have this tendency early on to fixate things with a top-heavy configuration, right? So, what is a canonical example of something with a top-heavy configuration? Well, that is the human face, right? You have two eyes and one mouth, right? And babies from even in utero, actually, there's evidence that babies prefer um, uh, stimuli that have that kind of configuration, right? Well, what does this mean? What are the ramifications or implications of this? Well, this means that when the baby is born, they're going to be focusing on certain aspects of the ray, namely where faces are, learning all about faces and all about humans, and not focusing on other things.
That
Right?
study in utero you're talking about, if you illuminate three dots in a
That's right.
triangle, the one with two dots on top that sort of looks like eyes and a mouth, as opposed to the regular facing triangle, babies look longer at that one because it's somewhat more face-like.
That's right. So I don't know about look longer. I don't know. I don't think that was the measure. Maybe that was the measure. I'm not exactly sure, but they show some kind of signature that suggests that they prefer the top heavy configuration, right?
Mhm.
And this is true even when they're after after having been born. And in any case, what function is the servo? As I was saying, it causes them to look at certain aspects of the visual array and not at others, right? And in so doing, they also have um, inborn innate domain general learning mechanisms that once they're orienting and once they're focusing on a specific part of the visual array, they learn about it by deploying these mechanisms, right? These mechanisms include everything from associative learning to conditioning to imitation, right? To statistical learning, right? These are very powerful mechanisms that combine with those biases can really get learning off the ground. But I don't actually think there's a need to argue that babies are born with, if by innate knowledge you mean innate rich knowledge, that is knowledge with content, right? So saying that what goes up must come down is a very contentful statement, right? It's a very rich statement. And or saying that unsupported objects fall is a very rich contentful statement, right? And there are folks who believe that babies actually are born with this kind of knowledge, right? I don't actually think we need to even go there. It's possible, sure. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I don't even think it's necessary to entertain those proposals because of the fact that babies come to the world with, these a small package of biases, which are devoid of content, importantly, and very powerful domain general learning mechanisms, right? Um, uh, and maybe it's that combination that separates us from um, our closest ancestors, right?
How
Maybe that's
about
one way. Yeah.
computer analogy? I'll throw out three terms here. So one would be hardware. So this could be like your actual brain, the things that's doing the computations themselves. Another would be software. And that's what I'm hearing in terms of these innate biases or learning mechanisms, because it seems like humans have those, but at the same time, other animals don't have them. And maybe it's not because they're not running the same software, so to speak, but maybe it's because they don't even have the right hardware for it. Maybe they don't have the level of memory or whatever else is needed to be able to store those biases or perform those computations. And then a third term would be just information
Yeah.
processing generally. So
Mhm.
information, you could say like that's the world around you. And again, regardless of what species you are, the world around you, the raw sense data that you could gather from it is going to be the same. But then if that's filtered through different hardware,
Yeah.
then the way you process that information, and then this gets back into that software analogy, that would be different.
Sure, absolutely. That seems completely plausible. That and the fact that we have language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Language is another vehicle by which we can learn about the world,
Uh-huh.
right? And non-human ancestors don't have that,
Now,
right?
in this analogy, would language be something like a unique software that's unique to humans?
Perhaps it could be an additional part of the hardware, right? It also there depends on who you're asking, right? So like if you're asking Chomsky, right, it absolutely would be part of the hardware, right? It's, language, you know, in the same way that we don't argue that we learn to have a heart, Chomsky argues we don't learn to have, right, language. It's sort of there. It's an organ, right? It's part of the hardware. It depends on who you're asking, right? To me, it doesn't matter whether it's in the hardware or the software. The point is we have this capacity. This capacity could be very useful combined with these innate biases and these domain general mechanisms. And that suite together may sort of distinguish us from our closest relatives. Right. That's to me, whether it's at the hardware level or the software level. I'm sure there's probably hardware level differences, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think you point to some, differences in information processing and whatnot. But that wouldn't, to me, be sufficient, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm sure you can find animals with excellent information processing, right? Elephants are actually quite good, right, at this kind of thing. So it wouldn't be
Mhm.
sufficient, right? But it absolutely would be required, one of the components, one of the key ingredients, right? But this is a question that philosophers and psychologists have been thinking about and toiling over for years. And I don't know if there will ever be an answer other than we have language, right? And we can do all sorts of language affords a lot of things, right? That you wouldn't get if you didn't have language, like recursion and all this kind of stuff, right?
Deon, your early research focused on language development. We've been talking about language as a sort of case study for this broader nature-nurture debate about the development of child cognition or the computations behind that. How did you then pivot to social and causal reasoning?
Right. So pretty much right away when I joined the lab, I knew that I wanted to go get a PhD, right? I didn't know what I wanted to get a PhD in, but I knew I wanted to get a PhD. Well, right around grad school application season, I decided to email a couple of folks whose work looked interesting and was similar enough to what I was doing at the time. One of those people who turned out to be my grad school advisor was a guy named Dr. David Rackison. He was doing at the time a lot of work on how infants and young kids categorize um, uh, things around them, right? And he was particularly focused on this distinction that lots of psychologists, developmental psychologists, have thought about, which is the animate and inanimate distinction. How do babies distinguish between animates and inanimates, right? And how do they come to categorize them as distinct categories, right? He was doing a lot of that work. And because I was doing work on categorization or a kind of categorization, I decided, oh, let me email him and ask whether or not he is taking on a grad student. I was lucky enough that he was taking on a grad student. The student he had at the time was graduating. And so it was like prime time for me to join the lab. In any case, when I started the program, this is Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University. I decided to study. I proposed a project that basically looked at, it sort of combined what he was doing with something that I was starting to become interested in, which was causal perception. And the project really was roughly about when do babies learn and how importantly do babies learn that people possess causal properties that objects don't, right? So you might ask, well, what are some examples? One example is that objects cannot move. Most objects cannot move in the absence of physical contact, right? So they have to be caused to move. Whereas people, we can move either in the absence of contact or in the presence of contact. There's really no constraints, right? So we have different, and we can also cause action at a distance, right? So if I saw a snake behind you, and let's say I knew that you were deathly afraid of snakes, I would say, Adam, watch out, there's a snake behind you. Obviously, I'm not there with you, but just by saying that, I would cause you to act and behave in some kind of way, right? So I can cause action at a distance. So the causal properties of people and objects differ, and how do babies learn that, right? And so that's actually what got me into the causal literature. broadly. And I was lucky enough, based on that project, to get the NSF GRFP to support that work. That was actually a project that I had thought up or conceived of prior to starting grad school. But I was already accepted at that time, and I emailed David and I was like, "Hey, here's this idea I want to study. Are you up for studying this?" And he fortunately was. He's a great advisor. He gave me a lot of freedom to study what it is I wanted to study. It was some of the best. Grad school was for me one of the best times of my life. But that's how I got into at least the work on causal learning. The stuff on social evaluation is a little bit different. So the
Before we get
pandemic,
there, I do
yeah,
have
yeah,
some questions
yeah.
about children's ability to detect animacy. Do they
Uh,
have a bias towards believing that everything is animate? Like in children's stories, you see everything has a face. You have like Goodnight Moon, you have the Cars movies, all these inanimate objects are personified.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So there are folks who certainly believe that. In fact, there are folks who would go a step further, right, to argue that babies have articulable knowledge. They can't articulate the knowledge, right? They don't have the mechanisms to actually articulate the knowledge, but they have the knowledge, right, about agents and about objects. That really is what Spelke's core knowledge perspective is all about, right? I, on the other hand, think that the answer probably is no, right? And that just like most other things, babies come to learn about animacy, right? Now, it is true that because of those inborn innate biases, they will be focusing on or spending a lot of their time looking at agents, right? Because one of the biases they have is a bias for a certain configuration of stimuli. Another bias that babies have is they much prefer to look at things that are moving than things that are static, right? Agents and animates tend to move, right? And if we do see any biases, right? If babies do have this tendency to think that most things are animates, it certainly, I would argue, is learned. And I think we come to the learning experience with the right tools to learn that and to learn it very quickly, such that some may actually think that it's innate, right? When in fact, I think it, it it's really learned,
Do you
right?
think we're tricking children by giving them then media where inanimate objects are animated? What do you think
This
the
is
motive is behind that?
this this is an interesting question, actually, and something that I've been talking to one of my colleagues about. And in particular, what we've been talking about is what role seeing the impossible, right, has on how babies perceive agents and inanimates, right? So it's only in cartoons that you see dogs walking other dogs as if like in Rocco's Modern Life, right? It's probably a dated reference. Do you know what Rocco's Modern Life is? Yeah, no, see, you're young. But it's only in cartoons that they see Wiley the coyote run off of a mountain and stay suspended in air, right? So they're being exposed to all of these impossible events, right? And so uh, you may sort of suspect based on that well, how they reason about and how they perceive these things should be equally affected. Uh, Now, I don't think there's a lot of data to speak to this one way or the other, but my best guess is that while it's true that they are, in fact, undoubtedly they are exposed to this kind of media, right? But I would wager that because I think babies are born with mechanisms that are very sensitive to what's out there in the world, right? And that's very sensitive to frequencies. The frequency with which they see these stimuli is far less than what they see than other things they see, right? And so to have a kind of impact on their perception of objects and the perception of agents, right? I would wager that you would really have to ramp up the amount of exposure, right? Now, obviously, things are even more interesting now with things like Alexa, right? Uh, you know, talking devices, right? That can't do anything else but talk, right? But still, I think that what matters and what's often overlooked in these discussions is the role of frequency. And if you're experiencing these things at a, not very frequently relative to your experience with things that actually obey physics, right? And babies have mechanisms that are sensitive to these statistics, then I'm not particularly worried, right? That's generally my perspective on this. But this obviously is an empirical question. You can test this.
Right. It's an interesting window into the child psyche when they get confused about certain things existing or not existing. So if you're thinking about different animals, for example, like take unicorns and giraffes and presume the child already knows about horses. You ask which one of these is more likely to exist. You tell them one is fake and one is real. And it's like, okay, a horse and it just has a horn. That seems reasonable versus a horse that also has like a 7 foot tall neck and yellow polka dots everywhere. It seems like the giraffe is the more absurd configuration, and yet they have to figure out this one's real and that one isn't.
Yeah. And I certainly don't think it's built in. I think the world is such that they come to learn that, right? And yeah, that's generally my perspective. Yeah.
Right, because like based on your training data, it seems like, okay, the horse looks sort of like a standard four-legged animal, and then lots of animals have horns. Maybe a unicorn does in fact exist, and giraffe is like really unique. Or you might say the same thing with dinosaurs, like why don't dinosaurs exist, but something funny like a peacock does?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This obviously makes testable predictions, right? So now this is not really my work, but like one prediction that sort of account makes is that at least early on, when they don't have the kind of experience that would be necessary to distinguish between these two, they should make the wrong kinds of inferences, right? They should say that unicorns are more likely than giraffes. They should say that, right? This kind of thing. Dinosaurs are more likely than peacocks. But as they go about the world and they're just simply observing, right? They come to sort of learn what is true and what isn't true.
I wonder if there's a language analogy, like children can learn regular grammatical rules about, like, the past tense of a verb, usually you add ed, but then there are some exceptions, like you say ran, you would
Swam,
say
yeah.
ran. Yeah. And then I wonder if they're doing that with visual perception as well, or categorization. Like you look at the world around you, you acquire sense data, and you look for these general patterns, and it causes you to make predictions about, in this case, animals, what's more likely to exist or not. But then sometimes there are these weird exceptions of exceptionally unique animals that do exist, and then
Right.
some maybe standard seeming animals that in fact don't exist.
Right. But crucially, though, in that account, you resolve this by experience, right? And you're like, I really like that analogy. Yeah, there's this big famous past tense debate, right? Children in the beginning do a pretty decent job. So if you say swim, they'll say swim. If you say jump, they say jump. So they do a pretty decent job. Then there's a point where they over regularize, right? That is, they add ed to everything, even verbs that shouldn't have irregular verbs. So they might say swim, swimmed, right? And then there's a point where they resolve that. And at least on one theory, one account, you might ask, well, what accounts for their initial success? Well, their initial success is probably due to the fact that they just don't have a large store of verbs to begin with, right? And they just, by happenstance, right, get lucky. But then as they go about the world, what they notice, if they're sensitive to the statistics and to the input, is that most of the verbs they hear end with ed. So to tie it back to your example about unicorns, most of the things they see look like unicorns, right? And so just by virtue of that, they make the wrong inference, or there will be a point in time where they make the wrong inference. And it's once they've learned, right, which verbs have ed ending and which verbs don't, that they can work out those idiosyncrasies, right? And realize, oh, okay, just, this thing looks like a horse, right? But it has this funny thing on top. right? So it's not a realistic animal, right? So I shouldn't categorize that as a sort of a known realistic thing, right? And maybe, yeah, maybe something like that is happening. But critically, though, like that account is a learning account, right?
Right.
I think that's the key.
So these learned overgeneralizations based on experience with the world, but perhaps not enough experience with exceptions to the rules, they apply to language, they seem to apply to categorization. Do they also apply to children's causal or social reasoning in your own line of research? Are there systematic errors that children will make?
Um, Not really. So, uh, so to study causal, I do work with infants looking at their capacity to perceive causal relationships, and I do work with kids looking at their capacity to reason about causal relationships. One is more effortful than the
Mhm.
other, obviously. And you don't see that same sort of they get it, they don't get it, and then they get it. The sort of U-shaped development that you see um, in the linguistic domain, at least causally. Um, Socially, and so right, so you don't typically see that kind of thing either with infants or with kids, at least as far as causality is concerned. Socially, so I study, and I should mention another topic I study in my lab, or a topic that I study is how babies come to learn to evaluate others based on their actions in the world, right? So how do they learn to distinguish between good people and bad people? And there is a large body of research looking at this particular topic with babies. And the commonly accepted takeaway is that not only do babies have this is a capacity that's evolutionarily ancient, that's unlearned, it's there from the very beginning, right? It's subserved by, some people use the term, it's supported by what's sometimes called an innate moral core,
Mhm.
right? Um, I take a very different approach. So I should quickly say that how do we test this? Like, how do we test whether or not babies can evaluate others? Well, one very simple but clever technique is to show babies videos in which, so just imagine a stage that has a hill on top of it. And let's imagine that there's a climber that wants to reach the top of the hill. But for some reason, it's unable to do that by itself. So each time it tries to go up the hill, it tumbles back down. So it's never able to reach the top. And let's say after a certain number of failed attempts, right, the climber is pushed up the hill, it's helped, right, by what we might call a helper. When other trials, the climber might be pushed down the hill uh, by what we might call a hinderer. What we can then do is we can actually literally present the helper and the hinderer to the baby in front of the baby and see which of the two they reach for. And in quite a number of studies, there's some exceptions, but in quite a number of studies, babies reach for the helper, right? And this has been taken as evidence that as part of the evidence that babies have this innate moral core. Um, I think that there is an alternative explanation for what's likely happening here. Firstly, I don't actually think that babies below a certain age, I'm starting to think these days it's uh, probably less than 6 months of age. I'm starting to think that babies younger than that don't even have the capacity whatsoever, right? And I'm happy to talk about why I think that's the case. But it turns out that in those studies, in a lot of those studies, not every study to be fair, but in a lot of those studies, whenever the climber and the helper are on the stage together, they're very often doing the same kind of thing. They're very often moving in the same direction, right? There's other studies that don't use the hill paradigm. They use what's called the box paradigm, where the protagonist wants to retrieve something from a box, but the box's lid is shut and the lid is ostensibly too heavy. And so in some trials, another character comes and helps the protagonist lift the lid to retrieve the toy. Right. In other trials, the hinderer comes and plops on top of the lid, causing it to slam shut. And even their babies reach for the helper. And so, but it turns out that whenever the helper and the protagonist are together, regardless of the paradigm, they're often doing the same kinds of things. Well, you might ask, well, why is that relevant in the real world? whenever two agents are doing the same things, they're very often interacting with each other, right? It would be weird, for example, for Adam and I to be walking around the neighborhood, literally walking in the same direction, not saying anything. I would think that I would be like, who is this creep next to me? Like, get away from me. Why aren't you talking? Why are you walking in lockstep with me? Right. Well, it turns out that for the hindering events, right, both characters are doing they're engaging in oppositional action. One person is doing one thing, the other person doing the exact opposite. In the real world, when would we see something like this? Well, a good example would be like a physical fight. We don't see a lot of fights, but that would be a good example where two parties are engaging in oppositional action. Well, what happens once the fight is broken up? Well, both parties go their separate ways. There is no opportunity for them to interact. Right? And so maybe what babies are learning in the real world is a sort of associative relationship between doing the same kind of thing in interaction and doing oppositional kinds of things in non-interaction. And so the reason why they might choose the helper is because they quite literally expect the helper to interact with them, because the helper will have engaged in an action that in the real world would have gone with interaction. Now, this account, of course, only works if we further assume that babies want to be interacted with, but there's a wealth of data to support that, right? And so now this is not exactly identical to the language case, because that was really the starting question. But here's a case where babies are making an inference based, having nothing to do with social evaluation, and it may be the wrong kind of inference, right? Because I can imagine a situation where we're doing the same kind of thing, but you're actually acting antagonistically, right? Right. It just so happens, though, that in these studies, doing the same kind of thing aligns with the pro-social action, right? But you can imagine studies where you tease this apart, right? And if my account is right, then I would expect that babies should do the wrong thing at least at some point, right? And
Have
then
those
have to
studies
resolve
been
it.
done, or are you in the
We're doing those
process of
studies
them?
now. Yeah, we're doing some of those studies now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So I love hearing about the different designs and what you're presenting to the infants. As you mentioned, it's kind of like working out a puzzle to see what they
Yeah.
can think, and then also how you can measure what they're thinking. Would you be able to share what the design is for this testing the antagonistic action?
Well, so that's a project that we're actually preparing now. Let me just say quickly something that you also might be interested in. So you asked, so I said, oh, well, there's a point in development where I don't even want to entertain the possibility that babies are evaluating. It shouldn't be possible. Why? It's because it turns out that without giving too much away, that those helping and hindering are fundamentally causal actions, right? To help someone is to cause them to achieve their goals. To hinder someone is to cause them not to achieve their goals, right? Well, that would mean then that because these actions are fundamentally causal, in order for me to see them as a helping action or as a hindering action, I have to see them also as causal. Well, we know that the capacity to perceive causality does not emerge until about 6.5 months of age. These studies are claiming to show social evaluation at 3 months of age. That's 3 months, 3.5 months earlier than when they can perceive causal relationships. So this raises a puzzle. Either they're not showing social evaluation, right? Because if what I'm arguing is right, that social evaluation requires the capacity to see the events as causal. So either they're not showing social evaluation, or we've gotten the whole thing wrong about when causal perception emerges. But there's a wealth of data showing quite clearly that the capacity to perceive causal relations is there about 6 months of age for artificial stimuli.
Is it possible that there's a third option, like maybe at 6 months of age, physical causal reasoning, assuming that's what you were talking about, develops, but maybe social causation is a category of its own, and maybe that could develop earlier?
It's possible, sure. But those events are fundamentally causal events, the way they're played, the way they're shown, right? And so I guess the way to test your account is to do an event that is still moral, right? That displays some sort of moral action, right? But that can't be explained on the basis of the underlying psychophysics, right? Causal psychophysics.
So to evaluate the causal role of helping or hindering someone in their goals, you also have to have an account of what the goals are. And that seems to require theory of mind. When does that typically develop?
So this is interesting. So there's been some work by Amanda Woodward um, showing that the capacity to perceive another person's goal emerges by about 5 months of age. So she has this classic study she did in 1998, whereby you have a stage, right, and you have two like support beams, right, and on top of one support beam is a ball, I believe, and on the top of another support beam is like a teddy bear, right, and during the experiment during habituation. So habituation is a technique where we show babies something over and over again until they become bored, right? So during habituation, a hand repeatedly reaches for the ball, right? And from the adult perspective, you might say, oh, the hand, it's like the person's goal is to retrieve the ball. That's why it keeps reaching toward the ball, right? So babies are shown that over and over again until they become bored. At test, they're shown two events. They're shown an event that's conceptually novel, but perceptually familiar, right? So the baby is now reaching in the same direction, but for a different thing, right? So now the baby's reaching for, what did I say? It was a bear now, right? It's now reaching for the bear. Or they're shown, they're shown on other trials, an event that's conceptually familiar, but perceptually novel. So now it's reaching in a different direction, but for the same object, right? That it was reaching for during habituation. And what she showed in that study is that babies look much longer when the goal changes. So when the actor now reaches for the teddy bear as opposed to the ball, right? And this has been is interpreted as evidence that babies can perceive and can reason about goal-directed action at about 5 months of age. Crucially, this is she showed that this is limited to social domain. So if you replace the hand with like a pincer, like a mechanical pincer that can grab things, babies don't show the same pattern of looking, right? And so goal directed action is about 5 months of age, right? And so this also still raises a problem, right? Because that's 2 months after when babies are said to be engaging in social evaluation. And part of that evaluative process means knowing that this thing has a goal. Well, goal directed action, perception of that doesn't emerge at 5 months of age. Something is up here, right?
Interesting. Are you familiar with any of Ashley Thomas's work?
Ashley Thomas, she's great. She did some cool work with Brandon Wu on saliva sharing.
That's the one I was thinking of. So this
yeah.
doesn't seem to be social causation so much as association. So in this study, you'd probably be able to describe it in more detail than
go
I.
Ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
From what I remember, so there are a few puppets, and the puppets are interacting with each other, and they can interact in different ways. Like they can hug, or they can shake hands, or they can share food, or they can kiss mouth to mouth. And I think what she found is that in a sharing food condition and in a mouth-to-mouth kissing condition, but not the other forms of social bonding that are just physical touch, but no saliva, that the infants expected the saliva sharing puppets to be closer together. And I think the way that they tested that they were closer is, again, looking at looking time and seeing that infants were more surprised when the less close puppets helped one in distress than when a more close puppet, because you would expect that the saliva sharing one is the one that comes to the rescue immediately. So they were less surprised by that, but they looked longer if one of the less close relationships, like maybe the handshake puppet, came in.
Yeah.
So that seems to be, you could make a causal claim there, but if
those babies were much older though, keep that in mind. These weren't 3-month-olds. I don't remember the exact age, but I know for a fact that they weren't really young babies.
Right. Okay, so I'm just using this paradigm as a jumping off place to speculate. So even if there's some causal relationship there as well, you could also imagine something merely associative. So maybe they don't know anything about the causal relationship of like, oh, closer people are more likely to help. But maybe they can just form a association pairing, like maybe I see people more often together when they're also doing things like kissing. So like mom and dad seem closer because I see them kiss and because I see them together all the time. And then that causes you to make that generalization that kissing is associated with closeness, but not necessarily causing closeness.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the alternative explanation I would give for that finding. Yep.
So
I
then
think that's completely plausible.
is it possible to have those sort of non-causal associations before 6 months of age?
Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What would be
Do
an
you
example
think that do we know if infants can learn to pair different either behaviors or features like maybe clothing or something like that with individuals? So I guess basically learning to recognize something as being associated with another thing, again, in absence of causal reasoning.
There's lots of research showing that babies have an exquisite capacity to associate non-causally relevant things. I do work. One of the mechanisms my lab studies is a mechanism that's called second order correlation learning. It's a mouthful, but it's a simple idea. So let's imagine A and B go together on some trials, and then that A and C go together on other trials, right? On the basis of if babies have this capacity to learn or to detect second order correlations, they should infer that, well, if A goes with B and A goes with C, well, B and C go together, even though I would have never seen B and C together, right? And I've done some work along with David Rakison. We published a study in infancy in 2019 that showed that they can use second order correlation learning to learn about how things move, like the movement properties, right? And it was crucially non-causal. It was like a non-causal context. Although you could make an argument that how something moves, right, whether it has a certain kind of property is what is associated with the capacity to move, but nonetheless, like we show that at least in a non-obviously causal context, they can form these really sophisticated associations. And then there's a whole bunch of work looking at their capacity to form more basic associations, right? So, and the work on statistical learning is a great example of that. There's some work by Leslie Cohen using what's called the switch design that sort of looks at this. So a switch design is one where, for example, A goes with feature one, B goes with feature two. And at test, I can show you either a familiar event where A again goes with feature one, or I can show you a switch event where now A goes with feature two, right? So crucially, they will have experienced all of the features and pairings. But if they've learned specific associations, they should look longer at the switched event than at the familiar event. And we can use this kind of paradigm and this paradigm has been used, right, to look at their capacity to learn arbitrary associations. So they absolutely have that capacity. Absolutely. That's one of the capacities we're born with, one of the domain general capacities we're born with.
So going back to this box paradigm, where in one case the helper helps open the box, and in the other case the hinderer sits on the box and makes it stuck closed, does the puppet or the person in the video look happy or excited after the box is opened in the helper condition?
Not really. No, they're careful to make sure that the reactions are right. Because one potential criticism is that, well, it looks happy. Babies like happy things.
Yeah, because then you could have like an association with happiness that causes the preference without there any, and then that would just be like, oh, this person is associated with happiness, even if I don't know anything about causation.
Yeah, no, they control for that. I will say though that there's a guy named Damien Scarf who tried to replicate the original helping and hindering studies. And what he found was that the character babies reach for depends on whether or not that character was associated with bouncing. So it turns out that in the original helping and hindering studies, I believe, once the climber once the climber is pushed up the hill and it gets to the top of the hill, it starts to jump. And it's like clearly celebrating. But the same didn't happen in the hindering event. And so maybe babies were reaching for the helper because it was indirectly associated with the jumping action, right? And so what he found was, what you would predict here is that, well, if you either remove the jumping at the top of the hill and you just like nothing jumps, babies should be at chance, which they were. Or if you make the hinderer, like after, like, so once the climber's pushed down, now the climber jumps up and down at the bottom of the hill, right? After it's pushed down, baby should choose the hinderer, right? Babies do that, right? And so they are sensitive to that and controlled
Right.
that in this other study. So
I
yeah,
imagine that didn't stop the debate there, because then people might say, well, then they just formed a causal association in the opposite direction if you're on the side that believes in that causal thing, because you could maybe think that, oh, if you're jumping for happiness, you must have achieved your goal. Therefore, the hinderer was actually a helper. So it's you can kind of get caught in an endless circle there.
right. It's hard to interpret whether or not they saw it as truly hindering, especially if the thing jumps, right?
Right. But
Which
these
is
new studies that you were mentioning designing, it
yeah,
seems like you're going to get at teasing those apart.
yeah, that's right. Something else we're going to be doing in our lab too is we're going to actually like I would. This is a long-term goal, but I want to actually look at what babies are actually seeing in the real world. So a lot of what I've been arguing like presupposes that the world is structured in a certain kind of way, and it's from this sort of structure that they learn these associations. But I'm making but that account is very speculative, and I'm very aware of that. And so the next step is to like put head mounted cameras on babies' heads and like look at the data and see what they're actually seeing, right? And So that's another important next step for my lab.
Is there a way to do something like that and eye tracking in the real world? So see not what they're looking at only on a screen, but see where their eyes are pointing in the real world?
So folks are actually working on that, because one of the problems with head mounted cameras is that like it's not directly it's a camera literally on top of the baby's head. So just imagine like a baby wearing a GoPro on top of their forehead, right? You don't get the kind of precision. Like you just get generally where the baby's looking, but you don't actually know exactly what the baby's looking at. And there are labs that are working on ways of doing this. The problem with babies is they hate stuff on their faces, right? And so they're always swiping at things. And so it has to be unobtrusive. But there are labs that are looking at doing this kind of thing. And that would be ideal, sure.
Yeah, and I want to close on a pretty big philosophical question. So we've been talking about uh, I guess they're really caricatures because there's going to be overlap, but on the nature side, with respect to moral cognition, it sounds like there's one camp of people who believe that children have an innate moral sense. And then on the other end of the spectrum, like everything is learning. There's no moral cognition whatsoever, but you build it up over time based on your environment. Um,
Yeah.
I want to talk about the implications of both of those worldviews, philosophical implications, because I imagine that the reason that the nativist view is so popular, I don't know scientifically if it's popular, like if one is dominant or the other, but the reason people might entertain the idea is because there's something warm and fuzzy about it. It's like children come into the world with a moral compass, and it's like, what a great story if that's true, right? And then the other way, it can be both optimistic or pessimistic, I guess, right? Because if they're raised in the right environment, then you get this good moral agent. But then there's also something scary about if you can learn like anti-morality if you're raised in the wrong environment.
Right. Right. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, the nativist position is in some sense warm and fuzzy. It's like, hey, babies are born with this, but it doesn't that sort of perspective doesn't explain individual differences. It doesn't explain differences in how we reason about moral events later on in life, right? So if babies are born with this moral sense, why do we see what look like qualitative differences during childhood relative to early infancy? And there have been some answers, proposed answers to this kind of problem. But on the other hand, I have to also acknowledge, like you said, that, you know, if you're raised in the wrong environment, right, you may well either not develop a moral sense or develop the wrong moral sense, right? Uh, what and so I guess the question is, you know, which account um, is the right one, right? Um, or which account maybe it's not the right one. Maybe that's not the right
Yeah, I
phrase.
don't think we have to resolve that here because
Yeah.
it sounds like you're in the camp of the learning camp. So I'm more interested in the implications of that. Like, what do you do
I
to then avoid the sort of depressing reality that some children can be raised in the wrong environment and not have this moral compass from an early age.
Well, you design interventions, right?
Mhm.
This is where the government can come in and local governments and agencies can come in, right? If it turns out that, let's say that, this issue won't be resolved, by the way, anytime soon at least, but let's say the issue was resolved and us learning theorists came out on top, right? Well, like in some sense that could spell doom and gloom, but it's also like an opportunity to like design, targeted interventions, either with local agencies, with the government, local governments, that kind of thing, right? To identify kids who are at risk, right? First and foremost, and then go into their living environment, to their environments, and structured in a way that can facilitate the emergence of a moral sense, right? And for me, that seems to be the much more attractive position, right? Because there's something, it provides an opportunity for us to do something, right? Versus, oh, it's just there from the beginning, right?
Right. So I guess there are really two philosophical questions there, because one is moral nativism versus empiricism. Are you born with a moral compass or do you have to learn it? And then the other one is moral realism versus relativism. Is there actually such thing as the right moral decision that you then can learn if you're a learning theorist? And so are you on the learning side, but also on the moral realist side?
This is an interesting question. Um, Whether or not there's right answers to moral questions is sort of
Because it seems like to
beyond
have
my
those interventions, you need to then presume that there's like a right answer to intervene with.
stabbing someone, pinching someone. Those are morally wrong actions with clearly right answers, right? For those
Mm-hmm.
cases, right, it's clear what ought to be done and what shouldn't be done, right? It becomes less clear for classic problems like the trolley problem, right, which again are beyond my pay grade. But so the kind of interventions I'm talking about would be interventions that would stop children, for example, from doing things that actually hurt people, which I think is objectively bad, right? Causing another person pain, like there's no if, ands, or buts about it, at least to me, right? And there's no relativism there. It's sort of, that's what it is, right?
Yeah, aggression, especially in early child development, is an interesting case study. Are you familiar with Richard Tremblay's work, or perhaps listen to the podcast we did?
No, I haven't. No.
He's a Canadian developmental psychologist. He's done decades of longitudinal research, starting in very young children and looking at how child behavior predicts later, child aggression predicts later adult aggression and criminality. So these are studies following children for like 20 plus years. We did a podcast together a couple of years ago, if listeners want to look into that. So he found that a small minority of children, mostly boys, were highly aggressive. So these are the types that in daycare were like getting into fights and biting other children and so on. And most of them get socialized out of it. So he started with, I believe, 4-year-olds. And then if you follow them into elementary school, most of the formerly aggressive children are just normal children. But then a small minority of them go on in the teenage years to remain aggressive. Some wind up in jail. So it's more like following the life trajectory. It doesn't really make any causal claims because we don't know if those young children, the minority who started off aggression or the minority who remained aggressive, we don't know if that's because they were raised in a very bad environment or if because they had like some genetic predisposition for aggression. So I guess we can't
You
really
don't know,
make
but if you can't make a claim, but if you know that this is the moral sense emerges based on just exposure, right? It doesn't really actually matter, right? Because now you know at least one way in which to curtail, right, negative behaviors. If in fact it turns out that the ground truth is that they learn this, they come to have a moral sense, right? Even if you can't, in this particular case, know exactly what the direction of the causal arrow is.
Right. because I,
Yeah.
I do hormones research. Now, this is in adolescents, not young children, but it's very well established that, especially in boys, testosterone is related to higher aggression, also higher risk taking and
Right.
impulsivity. And one more nativist theory, I suppose, is that if you have higher testosterone, then you're more likely to be aggressive or take risks. And this seems to be true not only in humans, but in other animals, like in other primates, for example, males are also more aggressive and also much higher in testosterone. So the nativist argument there would be something like testosterone or this sex difference is something that is genetically determined and it determines future behavior. And I don't know if it's true that acting aggressively increases testosterone levels. So then that would be going in the opposite direction rather
Yeah.
than hormones causing behavior. This would be behavior causing hormones. I think in reality, it's bidirectional because there's some interesting research looking at um, even sports team allegiance. Like if you're on a winning team, your testosterone levels rise a bit, and if you lose, then your testosterone levels go down a bit. So it doesn't have to only be related to aggression, but more like dominance, more
Yeah.
generally. So I could certainly see the bidirectional relationship, but there does seem to be this innate component as well. And the reason I bring that up isn't to argue that all conduct disorders or aggressive immoral behavior is innate, but rather to ask you, how do you deal with that in these interventions? Even if they're very early targeted interventions, and even if it's not a genetic root cause, but if it's maybe before the intervention started, the child was raised in the wrong environment and started off on the wrong track, that you're going to
Yeah.
see individual differences in how effective that can be. What do you do about that?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I'm not even sure I have the answer to this particular question. Um, yeah, it's not entirely clear what you would do um, in that kind of situation. Solution just would be just to remove them from their environment, but that's not ethical in a lot of cases, right? Um, Another is to just go in there and manipulate the kind of experiences they have, but maybe the parents don't allow you that opportunity, right? Don't provide you the opportunity to come in and do that sort of thing. So it's a tricky. It's hard to know. I'm not sure. I'm
Yeah.
not sure I have the answer, honestly.
Now, if we could end on an optimistic note, do you know of any existing or ongoing intervention studies that have produced some positive results?
The, to, Let me put it this way. Uh, we're not even close to getting to that point. And that's because any two labs, right, can produce the same data, but have wildly different interpretations of that data. Until we agree on what we're seeing and what's causing what's generating that data, until that happens, entertaining or thinking about possible interventions, at least as far as the stuff that I'm doing is concerned, is just it's a long way. We're a long way away from that, I'll say. And that goes for a lot of different topics in my particular field, right? We all, producing the data is like it's very common that we replicate each other's findings, but like we often have wildly different interpretations. And until we again agree on an interpretation, can we start to think about possible interventions for improving the learning outcomes of atypically developing populations, as an example, right? So check back with me in 200 years, and hopefully we'll be at some consensus.
Thank you, Deon. Is there
Yeah.
anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
No, this is great. If I have a Twitter account, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Deon T. Benton. That's the handle. There I talk about science and my passion for trash TV, among other things. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast today. It was fun.
Thank you very much for your time, Deon.
Yep.